The date September 11, 2001, is etched into the collective memory of the world. It began as an ordinary Tuesday morning with clear blue skies over the eastern United States. People were heading to work, children were in school, the nation was going about its business, but in the span of just a few hours, that sense of normalcy was violently shattered. 19 terrorists, affiliated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda, hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. They turned these planes into guided missiles, striking iconic symbols of American power and commerce. The world watched in horror as the attacks unfolded, broadcast live on television screens across the globe. It was a day of profound tragedy and loss, but it was also a turning point in modern history. The targets were chosen with deliberate, symbolic intent. 2 planes struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing both skyscrapers to collapse in a terrifying cloud of dust and debris. Another plane crashed into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense in Arlington, Virginia. The 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was brought down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers and crew bravely fought back against the hijackers. It is believed their intended target was another prominent landmark in Washington, D.C., possibly the U.S. Capitol or the White House. The coordinated nature of these attacks demonstrated a level of sophistication and malice that the world had not previously witnessed on such a grand scale. The immediate human cost was staggering. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks, including citizens from over 90 different countries. The events of 9/11 did more than just destroy buildings and take lives, they fundamentally altered the course of the 21st century. The clear blue sky of that September morning gave way to a long, uncertain twilight of fear and suspicion that would shape the decades to come. The events of September 11, 2001, unfolded with terrifying speed, forever altering the global landscape. At 8:46 a.m., Eastern Daylight Time, American Airlines Flight 11A Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Initially, many news reports treated it as a possible accident. That illusion was shattered just 17 minutes later. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, another Boeing 767 from Boston, slammed into the South Tower. At that moment, it became horrifyingly clear that the United States was under a coordinated attack. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the western facade of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. At 9:42 a.m., it ordered a nationwide ground stop, halting all civilian air traffic across the United States for the first time in history. Thousands of planes were ordered to land at the nearest available airport, leaving the skies eerily empty except for military aircraft. Meanwhile, a 4th hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was still in the air. Through phone calls to loved ones, passengers and crew learned of the attacks in New York and Washington. Realizing their plane was part of the same plot, they made the heroic decision to fight back. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, followed by the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, the U.S. government's primary focus was on emergency response and securing the nation from further harm. The first priority was a massive rescue and recovery operation at the 3 crash sites, Ground Zero in New York City being the largest and most complex. Firefighters, police officers, emergency medical technicians rushed into the chaos, many making the ultimate sacrifice. For days and weeks, rescue workers tirelessly searched through the twisted steel and rubble for survivors. Volunteers from across the country supported the effort. The hope for rescue soon faded, turning the monumental effort into a grim recovery mission to retrieve the remains of the victims and bring closure to their families. Simultaneously, the federal government initiated the largest criminal investigation in American history. The FBI quickly identified the 19 hijackers and began to piece together their connections to the Al-Qaeda terrorist network led by Osama bin Laden. The investigation, codenamed Pent Bomb, involved thousands of agents following leads across the globe. They examined flight manifests, tracked financial transactions, and analyzed communications to build a comprehensive picture. On the evening of September 11th, President George W. Bush addressed a grieving and fearful nation from the Oval Office. He declared that the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed the acts and those who harbored them. President Bush visited Ground Zero on September 14th, standing atop a pile of rubble with a bullhorn, promising that the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government moved swiftly to create a new legal and bureaucratic framework to combat terrorism. The centerpiece of this legislative response was the USA Patriot Act, an acronym for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. The bill was introduced and passed through Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, and President Bush signed it into law on October 26, 2001, just 6 weeks after the attacks. The act was designed to tear down the so-called wall that had prevented intelligence agencies and law enforcement from sharing information, a failure that many believed had contributed to the success of the 9/11 plot. The Patriot Act dramatically expanded the surveillance powers of the federal government. It gave authorities greater latitude to conduct wiretaps, monitor electronic communications like emails, and access personal records, financial, medical, and library records, without first needing to show probable cause of a crime. One of its most controversial provisions, Section 215, allowed for the bulk collection of telephone metadata, records of who called whom and for how long, but not the content of the conversations. Supporters argued that these tools were essential for tracking terrorists and preventing future attacks. Alongside these new legal powers, the government undertook the most significant reorganization of its federal agencies since the end of World War II. In November 2002, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act, which created the Department of Homeland Security. This new cabinet-level department consolidated 22 different federal agencies and offices: Coast Guard, Secret Service, Immigration and Naturalization Service, Transportation Security Administration. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the passage of the Patriot Act marked a fundamental shift in the balance between national security and individual liberty. Following the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration declared a global war on terror, a campaign that would, really define American foreign policy for the next 2 decades. The immediate target was al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, being sheltered by the Taliban in Afghanistan. President Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over bin Laden, dismantle the al-Qaeda training camps, or face the full might of the United States military. When the Taliban refused to comply, the United States prepared for war. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the U.S. and its allies, including the United Kingdom, launched Operation Enduring Freedom. It began with a series of airstrikes against Taliban targets and against al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan. The initial phase of the war in Afghanistan was swift. U.S. Special Forces worked closely with the Northern Alliance. This combination of advanced American air power and local ground forces proved highly effective. By December 2001, the Taliban regime had been overthrown, its fighters driven from major cities including the capital, Kabul. However, Osama bin Laden and other key al-Qaeda leaders escaped, likely slipping across the porous border into Pakistan. The quick military victory was followed by a long, difficult period of nation-building. While Afghanistan was ongoing, the Bush administration turned to another perceived threat: Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. The administration argued Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, ties to terrorist groups, and posed a growing danger to the United States and its allies. That case for war was built on intelligence, much of it later proven inaccurate or exaggerated. Despite international opposition, particularly from France and Germany, and without a UN Security Council resolution, on March 20, 2003, the invasion of Iraq began with shock and awe airstrikes. Like Afghanistan, the invasion led to a rapid military victory. Baghdad fell within weeks and Saddam Hussein's government was toppled. But the post-invasion phase proved far more challenging and costly, with complex destabilizing consequences for the region. One of the most immediate and visible consequences was a complete overhaul of airport and aviation security. The ease with which the hijackers had smuggled box cutters onto planes and taken control of the cockpits exposed some glaring vulnerabilities in the system. In response, the U.S. government created the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, in November 2001. This new federal agency took over airport screening from the private contractors that had previously handled it. Suddenly, travel by air became a much more regimented and scrutinized experience. Passengers were now required to remove their shoes, remove their belts, remove their jackets, and limits were placed on the liquids and gels they could carry on board. Cockpit doors on commercial aircraft were reinforced and kept locked throughout the flight to prevent unauthorized entry. The Federal Air Marshal Service, which places armed undercover officers on flights, was significantly expanded. These new security protocols were soon adopted by countries around the world, creating a new global standard for air travel. While these changes were broadly accepted as necessary for safety, they also brought longer lines, increased hassle, and a permanent sense of heightened security to the once routine process of flying. Beyond airports, security was also tightened at the nation's land borders and seaports. The newly formed Department of Homeland Security began implementing more rigorous screening procedures for people and cargo entering the United States. Programs like the U.S. Visit Program were introduced, which required most foreign visitors to be fingerprinted and photographed upon entry. Security guards and metal detectors became a common sight at the entrances to public buildings, stadiums, concert halls, and even some schools. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, an unprecedented wave of sympathy and solidarity for the United States swept across the globe. From London to Tokyo, world leaders condemned the attacks and offered their condolences and support. The French newspaper Le Monde famously ran the headline, "Nous sommes tous Américains," or "We are all Americans," capturing the sense of shared shock and grief felt by so many. For the first and only time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5, its collective defense clause. Article 5 states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This historic gesture really symbolized a united front among Western allies against the new threat of global terrorism. A broad international coalition supported the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. Countries around the world offered military assistance, intelligence sharing, and financial aid. Nations from the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, Canada contributed troops to the mission. There was a widespread consensus that the perpetrators of September 11th had to be brought to justice, and that the international community had a collective responsibility to confront the extremist ideology that had fueled the attacks. This period really represented a high point of international cooperation in the post-Cold War era. However, this global solidarity began to fray as the Bush administration's focus shifted from Afghanistan to Iraq. The push for a preemptive invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on disputed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, was met with significant international opposition. Key allies like France, Germany, and Russia strongly objected to the war, arguing that diplomatic solutions had not been exhausted and that an invasion would destabilize the Middle East. The decision to proceed without a clear United Nations Security Council mandate created deep divisions within NATO and strained transatlantic relations. The initial global sympathy for the United States had, in many quarters, transformed into suspicion and resentment, complicating diplomatic efforts and undermining America's soft power and moral authority on the world stage. More than 2 decades after the plane struck, the legacy of September 11th, 2001, continues to shape our world in profound and undeniable ways. The attacks ushered in an era of heightened security that has become a permanent feature of modern life. The inconvenience of airport security lines, the presence of surveillance cameras in public spaces, and the constant reminders to remain vigilant are now so commonplace that honestly, it's easy to forget they were not always the norm. This new security architecture, built to prevent another September 11th, has fundamentally altered our relationship with public spaces and our expectations of privacy. The balance between freedom and security, a debate ignited in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, remains a central and unresolved tension in democratic societies. The political and military landscape was also, irrevocably altered. The global war on terror led to the longest wars in American history: Afghanistan, Iraq. These conflicts reshaped the geopolitical map of the Middle East, toppled regimes, created power vacuums that allowed new extremist groups to emerge, like ISIS. The financial cost of these wars ran into the trillions of dollars, while the human cost, measured in the lives of service members and countless civilians, was immense. The legacy of these interventions continues to be debated. Questions about their effectiveness, their impact on regional stability, and their role in fueling cycles of violence and resentment. In the United States, the attacks fostered a powerful, if temporary, sense of national unity, but they also sowed seeds of division. Fear of terrorism led to increased suspicion and prejudice against Arab and Muslim communities, both in the US and abroad. Debates over immigration, surveillance, civil liberties became more polarized. The attacks amplified a sense of national vulnerability that has influenced American politics ever since, contributing to a more inward-looking and protectionist sentiment in some quarters. The shared trauma of that day has left a lasting psychological scar on the American psyche, a collective memory of loss and a lingering anxiety about the future. Ultimately, the day that began with a clear blue sky on September 11, 2001, cast a long shadow over the 21st century. It was a day that changed everything, from the way we travel to the way our governments operate, and the way we see the world and each other. It demonstrated the devastating potential of non-state actors to inflict catastrophic damage and plunge the world into a new and complex struggle against extremist ideologies. The enduring legacy of September 11th is a reminder of the fragility of peace and the profound ways in which a single day can redirect the course of history.